Everyone is talking about fuel prices. Everyone is talking about panic buying, but nobody's talking about this. This is the Liquid Fuel Emergency Act of 1984. It's a 40-year-old Commonwealth law, and it gives the Australian government the power to control how much fuel you buy, to direct companies on where the fuel goes, and, this is the part that caught me, compel refineries on what to produce. That's not regulation, that's closer to industrial command. And interestingly, it's never been used, not once in 40 years. But here's what people don't know and what isn't being talked about. These powers don't even require an emergency to be declared first. The government can start directing fuel companies to build reserves and develop rationing frameworks before anything is officially triggered. I'm James, I'm a former police officer, former prosecutor, and now a lawyer. I don't do geopolitics. I don't do speculation. I read legislation for a living, and I explain what it actually says, and this act, it's the most significant piece of emergency legislation that most Australians have never heard of. So by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what the government can do, what it can't, and where you sit in the priority list. And this may not be a surprise, but you're probably not at the top. Now, before we get into the mechanics, I want you to understand something about how emergency powers work in this country, because it changes how you'll hear everything I'm about to say. Governments don't write emergency powers during emergencies. They write them years, sometimes decades in advance. Then they sit there quietly until they're needed. COVID showed us that. Most Australians have never heard of biosecurity powers until we were living under them. Most people have never thought about what a state emergency actually authorises until police are enforcing stay-at-home orders. This is the same principle, different domain, and in some ways more far-reaching. Right now, you and I know that there are serious disruptions to the global fuel supply. Every news channel is covering that. But what we're going to be covering is the law. The how, because that's what's actually going to determine what happens to you at the pump. Now, most people assume that these powers only kick in during a full-blown crisis. Once an emergency is declared, the government steps in. And that's partly true, but partly is doing a lot of work, because certain provisions in this act are operational right now, without any emergency declaration. The minister can direct fuel corporations to maintain minimum reserves, not ask, direct. The minister can require fuel companies to develop what are called bulk allocation procedures, essentially pre-built rationing plans that are ready to activate at short notice. Think about what that means. The government can legally require fuel companies to prepare for rationing, including how they will redistribute supply across the country, before anyone has used the word emergency publicly. And if you're wondering whether or not they're already doing that, that's a reasonable thing to be thinking about. Like I said, these provisions have existed for 40 years. Whether or not they've been quietly exercised behind the scenes, the legislation gives them the power to do it, but there's no real record that I can find. But when it's an emergency that's been declared, that's when the real machinery starts. So it starts with a declaration. The relevant Commonwealth minister makes what's called a National Liquid Fuel Emergency Declaration. That's the trigger for the Act's full powers. And once that happens, the scope of what becomes legally available for the government to do is extraordinary. The easiest way to think about it is like a locked cabinet. Inside is a set of powers that let the Commonwealth government control the supply, distribution, sale, and use of liquid fuel across the country. The declaration is the key. So let's break down what this control actually looks like. The minister can issue directions to fuel companies about where fuel goes. Not suggestions, not guidelines, legally enforceable directions. If a fuel distributor is told to redirect supply from Sydney to regional New South Wales, they do it. The minister can regulate or completely stop the supply of fuel to specific areas, industries, or types of use. Not reduce, stop. And this is where it intersects with your daily life, because the Act supports a retail rationing framework. I want to be precise here. This framework draws on the Act, supporting regulations and government planning documents working together. But the practical effect is this. You could be limited in how much fuel you can buy, per transaction, per day, per vehicle. Now, the person watching this thinking, I'll just stockpile my jerry cans in the garage before any of that happens, you have to know this. Most states already have strict limits on how much fuel you can store at home, and how it must be stored. So you may well be breaking the law before rationing even starts. And it's important to get this right and to fix anything that may perhaps not comply, because there are powers for the authorities to investigate how much fuel you have, and we're going to get into that. So the rationing sounds kind of scary, and I guess it is, because most Australians, I mean, even just thinking of myself, I drive a lot. I drive to go to work, I drive to daycare, I drive to basically anywhere I need to be. But rationing is just the consumer-facing side. Behind the scenes, the government's powers go much further, and this is what I mean by that. They can compel fuel companies to maintain reserves at specified levels, so to limit the amount of fuel they let go out the door for you and me, and to keep it as a stockpile. The government is also able to direct the transfer of fuel between companies, and this is the one that surprised me the most going through the Act, they can issue directions on refinery output. What gets refined, how much, and where it goes. And leaving aside the fact we don't exactly have a lot of refinery happening in Australia. That's not the government regulating industry, that's the government directing production in a market economy under an Act of Parliament. And all of this, every direction, every restriction, every control, prevails over inconsistent state and territory laws. This is the Commonwealth override territory. If a state law conflicts with a direction made under this Act, the Commonwealth wins. So this is a really important document to understand before anything happens. Now I'm just going to break away for a little bit here, because if you think that more Australians should understand how this works before it happens, I know most would have loved that during COVID, consider subscribing. I'm a former cop, now I'm a lawyer, and I make these videos because I think people deserve to understand how legal power operates in this country before it's used on them, not after. We should be more involved in the system, but to get there, you need to know what's happening. Anyway, that's my piece. Now remember at the start I said you're not at the top of the priority list. Here's what I meant. The framework establishes categories of priority users. These are the entities that get fuel first in a rationing scenario. And this list tells you everything you need to know about what the government considers essential. And in a small nutshell, this is it. Police, defence, ambulance, fire rescue, public transport, taxis and essential passenger services. And of course the military. Think of it as like tier 1, primary access. Then you have things like hospitals, food supply chains and essential utilities. But do you notice what's not on that list? You and me. Driving to work, driving your kids to school, doing the grocery run. And I'm not saying that to scare you. I'm saying it because it reflects the legal reality of how fuel would be allocated if supply is genuinely constrained. There's a legal basis built into this framework for giving fuel to emergency services, defense, and supply chains before it reaches you at the servo. That's not a conspiracy, it's triage. And it's how emergency resource allocation works in every serious framework. Now here's what's interesting, and this is something that I went through in a lot of detail when I was reading the Act. This Act, with all these extraordinary powers, does not give the government the power to set fuel prices. They can control where fuel goes, they can control how much you buy, and they can control who gets priority. They can direct refineries on what to produce, but they cannot use this to say petrol is now $1.80 a litre, even though that would be great. Now, it doesn't mean that prices can't be regulated under other legislation. The ACCC has its own powers under competition and consumer law, but this Act is about supply, not price. And that distinction matters enormously, because in a genuine fuel emergency, you could find yourself in a situation where your fuel is rationed and the price of what you're allowed to buy has gone through the roof. And this Act addresses one of those problems, not both. Now, this is not what's called aspirational legislation, meaning it's just there to feel good. It has teeth, and they're through enforcement measures. We're talking inspection powers, seizure of fuel and equipment, civil penalties, so fines, injunctions, and in certain circumstances, forfeiture, meaning it's no longer your fuel. If a fuel company doesn't comply with a government direction under the Act, the government doesn't just send a strongly worded letter. There are legal mechanisms to compel compliance.
Then we send off my war rig to bring back gasoline from Castown.
This is legislation that was written to work under pressure, and the enforcement provisions reflect that. It goes back to the old adage of a law is only as serious as the consequences for non-compliance. And the consequences for non-compliance with this are serious. So let's bring this home. This is a 40-year-old Commonwealth Act to give the Australian government the power to declare a fuel emergency, ration fuel at the retail level, direct companies on supply and production, and override state laws to do it, and enforce compliance with real legal consequences. Some of those powers are already operational before any emergency is declared. It has never been invoked, and there is no precedent for what activation would look like in practice, meaning we don't know how this is going to look. Most people only learn about laws like this after they've been used. I'd rather you understood them before. If this has changed how you think about fuel policy in this country, and hopefully it's given you a heads up on what might be coming, share it with someone. And if you want to understand more about how legal power actually works in Australia, I've done a video on what happens when you're arrested, going through the entire thing from the moment you get arrested all the way to custody and bail. And the reason I'm doing this is really simple. I want people to understand the law. I want them to know what's happening so that when something like this happens, whether it be firearms reform, hate speech laws, potential fuel rationing, and I'm a bit late, but it would have been great to do it for COVID too, you can have a real say. You know what's happening, and when people try and say, that's not going to happen, it's just a conspiracy.
It's a conspiracy, man!
You know that's wrong. So stick around. I'm James Glissan, and I'll see you in the next one.